Tonight, we're covering the story and legacy of one of the most devastating and complex conflicts in European history, the 30 Years' War. This war began as a religious dispute within the Holy Roman Empire but soon spiraled into a massive continental struggle involving nearly every major European power. It changed borders, shattered empires, and left a lasting mark on diplomacy, religion, and the balance of power in Europe, echoes of which can still be felt today. So, before we all get nice and comfortable, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know the time and location from which you are watching. Now let's dive into this powerful and fascinating chapter of history, and we hope it helps you learn while you sleep. In the early 17th century, Europe stood on the brink of conflict. Political tension, religious divisions, and competing dynastic ambitions simmered beneath the surface, ready to erupt into a war unlike anything the continent had seen before. The year was 1618, and the Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling patchwork of principalities, duchies, and kingdoms across Central Europe, was teetering on instability. The spark came in the heart of Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic. Prague, its capital, was a city of religious friction, torn between Catholic authorities loyal to the Habsburg Emperor and Protestant nobles who fiercely defended their rights. For decades, tension between these factions had grown, intensified by the Reformation's legacy and the Counter-Reformation's aggressive Catholic resurgence. On May 23, 1618, that simmering conflict boiled over dramatically. Protestant nobles, angered by Emperor Ferdinand II's Catholic policies and his restrictions on Protestant worship, marched into Prague Castle. They confronted the imperial regents, officials tasked with enforcing the emperor's rule. The confrontation quickly turned heated. Shouts filled the room. Accusations of oppression and betrayal flew from both sides. Then, in a sudden act of defiance, the Protestant nobles seized two imperial regents, Wilhelm Slavata and Yaroslav Martinic, along with their secretary, Fabricius. Dragging them toward the windows of Prague Castle, the Protestants hurled the three men from the high window, an act history would later call the defenestration of Prague. Amazingly, the men survived the fall, landing in a pile of manure, a detail quickly seized upon by Catholics as evidence of divine intervention. But survival or not, the insult was clear, and its consequences would resonate far beyond Prague's cobblestone streets. The defenestration was not just an act of local rebellion, it was a declaration of war. Within weeks, Bohemia erupted into open revolt against Emperor Ferdinand II. Protestant nobles quickly formed a provisional government, rejecting Habsburg authority and declaring Ferdinand deposed. In his place, they crowned Frederick V of the Palatinate, a Protestant prince known for his ambition and Protestant sympathies. This bold move had immediate implications. Ferdinand II, unwilling to lose Bohemia or his imperial authority, assembled an army to crush the rebellion and reclaim the throne. But Bohemia would not stand alone. Alliances formed rapidly across Europe as neighboring states chose sides. Protestant territories saw Bohemia's cause as their own, fearing that Habsburg dominance would threaten their religious freedoms and autonomy. Catholic states rallied behind Ferdinand, determined to protect Catholic supremacy and imperial unity. Within months, what started as a local dispute had spiraled into a continental conflict. Armies marched, banners unfurled, and the first battles of the 30 Years' War unfolded. It would become a brutal struggle, stretching across 3 decades, involving nearly every European power, and devastating entire populations. The stakes were no longer just religion or local autonomy, they had become intertwined with European politics, territorial ambitions, and the balance of power. This war would reshape borders, redefine alliances, and transform the landscape of Europe forever. Few, however, could imagine just how long, destructive, and transformative the conflict would become. And so began the 30 Years' War, a conflict born from religious tensions and political intrigue, sparked by a dramatic act of rebellion, and destined to change the course of history. With the defenestration of Prague, the die was cast. Europe watched anxiously as the conflict quickly escalated from a regional rebellion into a continental struggle. The Protestant nobles of Bohemia, emboldened by their decisive action, rejected Emperor Ferdinand II's authority outright. Instead, they turned toward Frederick V, Elector Palatine, a prominent Protestant leader whose acceptance of the Bohemian crown in 1619 added fuel to the already blazing fire. Frederick's acceptance of the throne was a direct challenge to Habsburg dominance. Known as the Winter King, his rule would prove tragically short, but his decision dramatically widened the conflict. By taking the Bohemian crown, Frederick invited retaliation not only from Ferdinand but from Catholic forces across Europe who feared the Protestant advance. On the other side, Protestant states throughout Germany and beyond saw Frederick stand as a bold defense of their religious liberties, compelling them to rally to his cause. Ferdinand too wasted little time. In response to Frederick's ascension, he marshaled his formidable military resources and called upon Catholic allies, notably the powerful Bavarian Duke Maximilian and the Spanish Habsburgs. This powerful Catholic coalition aimed to crush Protestant resistance and restore imperial authority decisively. The first major battle came quickly. At White Mountain, just outside Prague, in November 1620, the Protestant forces faced off against Ferdinand's disciplined and experienced Catholic army. Despite their passion and initial zeal, the Protestant troops proved no match for the well-trained imperial soldiers. In just 2 hours, the Protestant forces collapsed under relentless attack. Frederick fled into exile, and Ferdinand's armies marched victoriously into Prague. The Battle of White Mountain was more than just a military defeat, it was a catastrophe for the Protestant cause. Ferdinand's victory allowed him to impose harsh punishments on Bohemia's rebellious nobles. Lands were confiscated, Protestant churches shuttered, and those who resisted were imprisoned or executed. Ferdinand II's actions signaled to Protestant Europe that the Catholic Habsburgs would use every measure necessary to enforce their rule. Yet, despite Ferdinand's apparent triumph, the war was far from over. The struggle quickly spread beyond Bohemia's borders, fueled by religious conviction, political ambition, and lingering grievances. Protestant rulers in northern Germany, Denmark, and Sweden watched with increasing alarm. They feared that if Bohemia's defeat went unanswered, they would be next. Catholic powers, particularly Spain, saw an opportunity to extend their influence across Central Europe. In the years following White Mountain, the war intensified, spreading like wildfire. Protestant forces regrouped, forming new alliances. In response, the Catholic League bolstered its ranks, drawing support from Italy, Spain, and southern German states. The conflict that had begun as a localized rebellion in Bohemia was now a full-scale war, enveloping much of Europe. Cities burned, fields were devastated, and villages suffered under marching armies. Soldiers, often poorly paid or supplied, turned to plunder to survive, leaving devastation in their wake. Both sides resorted to harsh measures, each determined to outlast the other. And yet, amid the escalating violence, neither side could claim decisive victory. Battles multiplied, alliances shifted, and commanders rose and fell, yet the war dragged on. Leaders across Europe began to realize this was not just a religious conflict, it had become a brutal struggle for power, survival, and dominance that neither Protestant nor Catholic Europe could afford to lose. Thus, as the conflict entered its next phase, it became clear the 30 Years' War had become a relentless contest of endurance. A war that would demand unimaginable sacrifices from every nation and every person caught in its deadly embrace. By the mid-1620s, the 30 Years' War had transformed from a regional conflict into a vast European struggle, enveloping new territories and drawing in powerful rulers. After their decisive victory at the Battle of White Mountain, the Catholic forces, led by Emperor Ferdinand II, had strengthened their grip across Central Europe, imposing their will on Protestant lands. But the conflict was about to escalate once again, this time with the entrance of a powerful northern kingdom, Denmark. King Christian IV of Denmark, a Protestant ruler with significant influence in northern Germany, watched with concern as Ferdinand's Catholic forces expanded their reach. Christian was ambitious, politically astute, and deeply committed to the Protestant cause. Yet his motivations were not purely religious. He also saw an opportunity to expand his own power and influence. His intervention, therefore, was both ideological and strategic. In 1625, Christian IV formally entered the war, leading a coalition of northern Protestant states. With financial support from England and the Dutch Republic, he confidently marched his army into the German territories, hoping to push back Ferdinand's Catholic forces and reclaim lost ground for Protestantism. At first, the outlook seemed promising. Christian's forces moved swiftly, taking control of key towns and fortresses, and galvanizing Protestant support across northern Germany. However, Ferdinand was ready. Recognizing the threat posed by the Danish king, Ferdinand turned to a new and powerful ally, a brilliant, ambitious military leader named Albrecht von Wallenstein. Wallenstein was an enigmatic figure, a wealthy Bohemian noble with an exceptional talent for raising armies and inspiring fierce loyalty among his soldiers. Ferdinand granted Wallenstein extraordinary authority to build and command a vast imperial army, promising him not only funds but land and power if victorious. Wallenstein's response was remarkable. Within months, he had assembled one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen, tens of thousands strong, drawn from mercenaries and volunteers across the continent. Unlike most armies of the time, Wallenstein's troops were loyal primarily to him rather than to any state or cause. His military genius, combined with ruthless discipline, quickly turned the tide against Christian IV. The Danish and imperial armies clashed in a series of brutal battles. The turning point came in 1626 at the Battle of Lutter and Barenberg. Wallenstein's disciplined, well-equipped forces utterly crushed the Danish army, leaving thousands dead or captured and Christian IV's hopes shattered. Denmark's advance into German territory quickly collapsed, and Christian was forced into humiliating retreat. The defeat at Lutter was devastating for the Protestant cause. Wallenstein's imperial forces swept northward, occupying towns, fortresses, and territory. The Danish intervention, initially so promising, had ended in disaster. By 1629, Denmark had no choice but to negotiate peace. In the Treaty of Lubeck, Christian IV agreed to withdraw completely from the war, relinquishing all territorial ambitions in Germany and pledging never again to interfere in imperial affairs. The collapse of Denmark's campaign strengthened Emperor Ferdinand's position dramatically. Believing he had finally secured dominance over Protestant territories, Ferdinand confidently issued the Edict of Restitution in 1629, a controversial decree ordering Protestants to return all lands they had seized from the Catholic Church since 1552. Instead of ending the war, however, the edict only inflamed tensions further. Protestant leaders across Europe, humiliated and fearful, began seeking new alliances to counterbalance Ferdinand's aggressive policies. Attention soon shifted north once again, this time to another powerful kingdom whose ruler was determined to reverse the Catholic tide. Sweden's King Gustavus Adolphus was watching carefully, fully aware that his entry into the war might decide not just his nation's future, but the destiny of Europe itself. Thus, with Denmark's exit, a new, even more destructive phase of the 30 Years' War was about to begin. As the 1630s dawned, Central Europe lay battered and divided. The Protestant cause had suffered crushing defeats, and Emperor Ferdinand II's power appeared unrivaled. But just as the imperial grip seemed unshakable, a new figure emerged from the north, a warrior king whose entry into the war would reignite Protestant hopes and alter the course of the entire conflict. His name was Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden. Gustavus was no ordinary monarch. Known as the Lion of the North, he was a brilliant military commander, deeply pious, and fiercely committed to defending Protestantism. But like Christian IV of Denmark before him, his motivations were not purely spiritual. Sweden had long-standing interests in the Baltic and German regions, and Gustavus knew that unchecked Habsburg expansion threatened both his religion and his realm. In 1630, Gustavus Adolphus landed on the northern coast of Germany with a disciplined Swedish army. His forces, though modest in number at first, were among the best trained and most innovative in Europe. Gustavus had revolutionized warfare, introducing flexible infantry formations, coordinated cavalry tactics, and more mobile artillery units. Unlike many other commanders of the time, he insisted on discipline, loyalty, and the humane treatment of civilians. Gustavus' arrival was met with caution. Protestant German princes, burned by Denmark's failure, were hesitant to trust another foreign savior. But Gustavus won hearts and minds through his victories and his leadership. He portrayed himself not as a conqueror but as a defender of liberty and faith. In 1631, he achieved a decisive and symbolic victory at the Battle of Breitenfeld near Leipzig. Facing the powerful Catholic League army under General Tilly, Gustavus' forces executed a brilliant strategy, using mobility, timing, and superior discipline to crush the enemy. The victory electrified Europe. For the first time in over a decade, the Protestants had scored a clear and overwhelming triumph. Following Breitenfeld, Protestant cities and princes that had remained neutral or loyal to the emperor began to join Gustavus' cause. His army swept through much of central Germany, liberating towns and reversing the Catholic gains of the previous decade. In 1632, the Protestant forces faced their greatest challenge yet, the mighty Wallenstein, whom Ferdinand had recalled to service in desperation. Wallenstein had rebuilt his army and was determined to stop the Swedish advance. The two titans of the war met at the Battle of Lutzen in November 1632, a clash that would go down as one of the bloodiest and most significant of the entire conflict. The battle was fought in thick fog and bitter cold. For hours, chaos reigned as muskets flashed and cavalry charges crashed through smoke and mud. The Swedish forces pressed forward, slowly gaining ground, but at a terrible cost. In the confusion, Gustavus Adolphus became separated from his men. He was shot, surrounded, and ultimately killed. His death sent shockwaves through Europe. Though the Swedes ultimately won the battle, the loss of their king was devastating. Gustavus had been more than a commander. He had been a symbol, a unifying force for the Protestant cause. Without him, internal divisions resurfaced. Leadership struggles emerged. The Protestant momentum began to falter. Still, Gustavus' legacy endured. He had changed the war's dynamics. He had proven that the emperor could be challenged and beaten. And he had inspired a new wave of resistance that would carry on long after his death. As the 1630s continued, the war would grow only more complex and devastating. New players would emerge. Alliances would shift. And beneath the banners and battlefields, Europe's people would continue to suffer, caught in a storm of ambition, faith, and fire that showed no sign of ending. By the mid-1630s, the war had entered its most chaotic and brutal phase. With the death of Gustavus Adolphus at Lutzen in 1632, the Protestant forces had lost their greatest leader. The vacuum of leadership left Sweden's army fragmented, and its German allies increasingly disorganized. But despite the setback, the war did not end. Instead, it deepened. The conflict, which had begun as a struggle over religion and sovereignty, now evolved into a war of opportunism and survival. No longer driven solely by Catholic-Protestant rivalry, the war had become a struggle among great powers, each determined to reshape the balance of Europe to its advantage. In Sweden, Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna, Gustavus' trusted advisor, took control of the war effort. Though not a military man, Oxenstierna was a brilliant strategist and diplomat. He maintained Sweden's commitment to the war, reinforcing their armies in Germany and forming the Heilbronn League, an alliance of Protestant German states committed to continuing the resistance. But the forces opposing them were equally determined. Emperor Ferdinand II, still backed by the Catholic League in Spain, leaned heavily on Wallenstein, who had been recalled to command once again. Wallenstein had become more powerful and autonomous than ever. His army was vast and feared, his ambition even more so. By now, Wallenstein was not just fighting for the emperor, he was fighting for his own influence. He carved out semi-independent territories, negotiated with foreign powers without imperial approval, and behaved more like a warlord than a loyal general. His growing independence and rumors of secret negotiations with both Protestants and France alarmed Ferdinand. In a secret move, the emperor ordered Wallenstein's assassination. In 1634, Wallenstein was murdered by his own officers at Eger, likely under imperial orders. His death marked the end of a uniquely complex and dangerous figure, one who had both preserved and threatened the very empire he had served. That same year, the Catholic forces struck a crushing blow at the Battle of Nordlingen. Spanish and Imperial armies dealt the Swedish-led Protestant forces a devastating defeat. The Protestant alliance fractured. German princes began to sue for peace, and Sweden's position in the war weakened significantly. It seemed, once again, that the Emperor and his Catholic allies were poised to reclaim total control. But as often in this war, victory brought new enemies. Now, another major player entered the fray, one who had been watching the war unfold from the sidelines, calculating, waiting for the right moment. France, a Catholic country, had long feared the growing power of the Habsburgs. Though France had not officially joined the war, Cardinal Richelieu, the chief minister to King Louis XIII, had been secretly funding Protestant allies for years. For Richelieu, the war was not about religion, it was about political balance. A dominant Habsburg Empire, stretching from Spain through Austria and into Germany, was a direct threat to France. After Nordlingen, Richelieu could wait no longer. In 1635, France declared war on Spain and officially entered the 30 Years' War, on the side of the Protestants. The irony was not lost on anyone, a Catholic kingdom now fighting against Catholic powers to support Protestant resistance. It was a clear sign that the war had fully transformed, no longer a crusade of faith, but a battle for political supremacy across Europe. The war widened. New armies marched. Old alliances collapsed. And the suffering of the people deepened. Villages burned. Fields were salted. Entire regions were depopulated. Soldiers looted towns, raped and killed civilians, spreading disease and famine in their wake. For the common people, the banners and ideologies no longer mattered, only the endless march of war and the hunger it brought. By the late 1630s, Europe was bleeding. And yet, the end was still nowhere in sight. By 1635, the 30 Years' War had entered a new and even more destructive phase. What had started as a religious conflict within the Holy Roman Empire now involved all the major powers of Europe, and at its center was a struggle for political dominance between the Habsburgs and the rising power of France. France's entry into the war marked a dramatic turning point. Though a Catholic nation, France had allied itself with Protestant forces to curb the expanding power of the Habsburg dynasty, which ruled both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. Cardinal Richelieu, France's chief minister, understood that political survival trumped religious unity. His goal was to break the encirclement of France by Habsburg-controlled territories. The French military campaign began slowly. France's army was powerful but untested in the brutal tactics that had come to define the war in Germany. French generals struggled to match the experience and ruthlessness of their imperial and Spanish counterparts. Meanwhile, Spain, with its elite tercios, infantry units renowned for their discipline, continued to dominate many battles. But France had resources. And France had resolve. They began by supporting Swedish and Dutch forces financially and militarily. Swedish troops, still present in Germany, were revitalized by French aid. Meanwhile, France launched its own invasions into Alsace, the Spanish Netherlands, and even deep into northern Italy, opening new fronts that stretched Habsburg forces thin. As the war escalated, so did the suffering. By the late 1630s and into the early 1640s, Germany had become a land of ash and ruin. Armies from all sides crossed the same territories over and over, plundering villages, consuming crops, and displacing populations. Civilians fled in all directions. Famine and plague followed in the army's footsteps. Fields once golden with wheat now stood trampled or blackened. Towns were reduced to rubble. The population of many German states fell by more than half. No region was safe. Even the most devout churches or ancient cities could not escape the ravages of war. In some places, monasteries were looted, libraries burned, and peasants massacred. The war had become a machine, driven by money, men, and desperation. Still, even amid the horror, military innovation continued. France reformed its armies, creating more modern command structures and improved logistics. It began to match Spain's battlefield discipline and even surpass it. French commanders like Louis de Condé and Henri de Turenne began to earn reputations as tacticians who could challenge the Habsburgs' strongest generals. The Spanish, stretched thin from wars in Italy, the Low Countries, and now Germany, began to lose their momentum. Though still dangerous, their tercios were no longer invincible. The Dutch, fighting for their own independence in the 80 Years' War, gained ground against Spanish forces, aided by French support. Meanwhile, in the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor Ferdinand II died in 1637 and was succeeded by his son, Ferdinand III. The new emperor was more open to negotiation than his father but still unwilling to surrender the empire's authority. He faced the reality that imperial resources were drained, the war was unpopular among his own subjects, and no clear victory was in sight. By the early 1640s, both sides began to feel the pressure. Decades of bloodshed had yielded little but destruction. Every victory was temporary. Every gain was followed by loss. The idea of a unified Holy Roman Empire under Catholic dominance was fading. At the same time, France and Sweden saw an opportunity, not just to stop the Habsburgs, but to reshape Europe's future entirely. The battlefield remained the same. But now, the fight was not for faith, it was for who would rule the continent. And as long as that question remained unanswered, the war would continue. By the early 1640s, the war had reached a grim equilibrium. Major powers continued to hurl armies across Europe, but neither side could deliver a knockout blow. The balance of power had become a dance of attrition. Territories won and lost, cities besieged and abandoned, lives sacrificed for ground that might change hands again within months. The Holy Roman Empire, once the centerpiece of the Habsburg dream, was fractured beyond recognition. Its patchwork of principalities and free cities had each suffered differently, some reduced to ashes, others surviving only through neutrality or sheer luck. Peasants roamed the countryside in search of food or shelter. Once thriving towns echoed with silence, their populations lost to famine, plague, or the sword. Despite the endless devastation, war efforts pressed on. In France, military commanders had begun to gain the upper hand. Louis II de Bourbon, Prince of Condé, achieved a major victory at the Battle of Rocroi in 1643, just days after the death of King Louis XIII. In that battle, the seemingly invincible Spanish tercios, disciplined infantry formations that had dominated battlefields for a century, were decisively broken by French forces. Rocroi was more than just a tactical success. It was a symbolic turning point. For the first time, the aura of Spanish battlefield supremacy had been shattered. France, long a political rival of Spain and Austria, was now undeniably a military rival as well. Meanwhile, Sweden, though shaken by the loss of Gustavus Adolphus a decade earlier, had re-established its position in the war. Under generals like Leonard Torstensson, Swedish forces swept through Saxony, Bohemia, and Moravia. These campaigns, while often brutal, proved Sweden's enduring influence on the German stage. Emperor Ferdinand III, unlike his father, understood that total military victory was slipping further from reach. His authority within the empire was weakening, and the loyalty of its many princes and electors was uncertain. Even Catholic allies within the empire had grown weary of war, resenting the ongoing demands for men and money. On the Protestant side, similar fractures began to appear. The unity that had once rallied around Gustavus Adolphus had splintered into competing agendas. German princes feared foreign domination, whether from France, Sweden, or the emperor himself, and began to seek separate paths toward peace. By now, the war had outlived its original causes. Religious fervor, once the driving force, had been eclipsed by political ambitions and sheer momentum. The lines between Protestant and Catholic, between defender and aggressor, had blurred. Soldiers fought less for faith and more for pay. Mercenaries roamed from one employer to the next. Campaigns dragged on for the sake of keeping armies fed and officers in command. Still, behind the scenes, a shift was coming. A growing number of voices, diplomats, nobles, even generals, began to argue that peace was not only desirable but necessary for survival. Decades of war had reshaped Europe, not through conquest, but through exhaustion. And while treaties had been proposed in earlier years, they now gained serious momentum. By 1644, delegations began to gather in Westphalia, a region in northwest Germany, to discuss an end to the war. The city of Münster hosted Catholic negotiations, while Osnabrück became the center for Protestant and imperial talks. The effort would become one of the most ambitious diplomatic undertakings in European history, involving hundreds of envoys, years of negotiation, and the challenge of reconciling 3 decades of grievances and bloodshed. The battlefield was still active. Armies continued to move, to siege, to kill. But at last the end was in sight, a distant shape on the horizon, fragile and uncertain. After 30 years of war, the question remained. Could peace finally tame a continent that had burned for a generation? By 1645, the armies of Europe were battered, the people broken, and the coffers of kings nearly empty. The 30 Years' War had turned vast regions of Central Europe into a graveyard. Still, while peace negotiations in Westphalia had begun, the violence persisted. Diplomacy and war moved in parallel, each influencing the other. The Peace of Westphalia wasn't a single treaty. It was a sprawling negotiation process spread across years and cities. Delegations from nearly every major European power gathered in the towns of Münster and Osnabrück, attempting to bring an end to not only the 30 Years' War but also related conflicts like the 80 Years' War between Spain and the Dutch Republic. The complexity was immense. There were more than 100 delegations, each with their own demands. Religious leaders, envoys from free cities, kings, emperors, and republics, all vying to protect their faith, secure their borders, and reshape Europe in their favor. The task was to find common ground after decades of shifting alliances and countless betrayals. At the heart of the negotiations were 3 powers. The Holy Roman Empire, still represented by Emperor Ferdinand III, who sought to preserve imperial authority and maintain Catholic dominance where possible. France, led by Cardinal Mazarin after Richelieu's death, determined to break the Habsburg stranglehold and expand French influence. Sweden, now governed by Queen Christina, continued to push for territorial gains and religious guarantees for Protestants, especially in Germany. The Dutch and Spanish, too, were negotiating their own terms. After 80 years of rebellion and intermittent war, the Dutch Republic sought full independence from the Spanish crown, while Spain, now militarily overextended and economically drained, was finally ready to consider letting go. Throughout these diplomatic efforts, the war dragged on in the background. In Germany, campaigns continued. Swedish General Torstensson led assaults deep into Habsburg territory, threatening Vienna itself. French troops battled Spanish forces across the Rhine and in the Spanish Netherlands. Cities changed hands, only to be lost again. Armies scavenged the land for food and resources, leaving scorched earth behind them. Meanwhile, the civilian population, what was left of it, clung to survival. In many areas, fields went untilled, churches stood in ruins, and entire generations knew only war. The death toll, both from combat and the resulting famine and disease, is estimated to have reached up to 8 million across Europe, most of them civilians. Despite this, progress at the negotiating table was slow. Disagreements over religion, especially the treatment of Calvinists, remained fierce. The emperor resisted calls to weaken his power within the empire, while France and Sweden insisted on carving new influence out of Habsburg territory. Each side feared giving too much, and losing everything. But weariness began to shift the tide. The emperor recognized that the dream of a fully Catholic, centralized empire was gone. Protestantism had endured, even flourished in some regions. His own princes, many of them Catholic, were exhausted and increasingly independent, more concerned with their own survival than with enforcing imperial unity. Likewise, Spain, once Europe's most dominant power, found itself isolated and overstretched. The defeat at Rocroi, years of war with the Dutch, and domestic unrest forced Madrid to reconsider its role. The Spanish Empire was in slow decline, and its leaders could no longer ignore reality. In 1648, after years of fighting, negotiating, and compromise, the Peace of Westphalia finally began to take shape. It would not be perfect. No treaty could undo 3 decades of destruction. but it would bring an end to the bloodshed and lay the groundwork for a new political order. The question now was no longer who would win the war, but who would win the peace. After 3 decades of bloodshed, in October 1648, the treaties that became known as the Peace of Westphalia were finally signed. They did not come with celebration or triumph, only quiet exhaustion and cautious hope. The war had dragged on for so long that few alive remembered a time without it. But now, the pens moved across parchment, sealing agreements that would redraw the map of Europe and redefine international diplomacy. The Peace of Westphalia consisted primarily of 2 major treaties: the Treaty of Münster between the Holy Roman Empire and France, and the Treaty of Osnabrück between the Empire and Sweden. These, along with other accompanying agreements, brought an end to the 30 Years' War in the German lands and the 80 Years' War between Spain and the Dutch Republic. Among the most significant outcomes was the recognition of sovereignty. The Holy Roman Emperor, once believed to be the unifying figure of Christendom, now had to acknowledge that each prince, bishop, and noble within the empire held the right to determine the religion of his own territory, Catholic, Lutheran, or Calvinist. This formalized the religious fragmentation of Germany and ended the dream of a unified, Catholic empire. The Dutch Republic was officially recognized as independent from Spain, marking the successful end of their long struggle for autonomy. Meanwhile, France and Sweden secured territorial gains. France acquired parts of Alsace, and Sweden gained key areas in northern Germany, including control of Pomerania, giving it access to the Baltic Sea and a seat in imperial politics. The political order of Europe had changed. The principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of other states, introduced in the treaties, laid the foundation for modern concepts of state sovereignty. For the first time, diplomacy was used on such a large scale to create peace, not through domination, but through compromise and balance. But while diplomats and kings spoke of a new order, the people of Europe faced a very different reality. Germany was in ruins. Entire regions had lost half, or more, of their populations. Some towns were completely depopulated, left to nature. Agriculture, trade, and commerce had collapsed in vast areas. Disease still spread in the aftermath of displacement and hunger. Survivors faced an uphill battle to rebuild not just homes and fields, but society itself. The cultural scars ran deep. The war had eroded trust between communities, between confessions, and even within families. It had created a generation of soldiers who had known nothing but violence. For decades after 1648, veterans turned mercenaries roamed the countryside, and trauma lingered in the stories passed down through generations. And yet, amid the devastation, peace endured. The Peace of Westphalia did not end war in Europe, but it ended this war, the one that had consumed the heart of the continent for 30 long years. It established a framework for diplomacy, one that would influence treaties for centuries to come. For the first time, war had been concluded not simply by conquest, but by dialogue and negotiation among equal powers. It marked the beginning of the modern international system, where balance of power, diplomacy, and mutual recognition would, at least in theory, replace religious wars and dynastic absolutism. As church bells rang across Europe and soldiers laid down their arms, many could hardly believe it. The war that had begun with the defenestration in Prague, a protest over faith and freedom, had ended with treaties that echoed far beyond religion. The question now was what kind of world would rise from the ashes. The 30 Years' War ended not with a single triumphant moment, but with a slow and painful exhale. When the treaties of Westphalia were signed in 1648, the armies did not vanish overnight, and the wounds did not heal with the ink on the page. Europe, especially the German-speaking lands, was left scarred, weary, and forever changed. The legacy of the war would shape the continent for centuries. In Germany, the Holy Roman Empire remained in name but was fractured beyond repair. Its princes and states, now formally sovereign, became semi-independent actors. Though nominally under imperial authority, they ruled as they pleased, with their own armies, laws, and foreign policies. The emperor was no longer the political or spiritual unifier of Central Europe. That role had vanished, buried under decades of violence and the ashes of ambition. This fragmentation stunted Germany's unification for over 200 years. The German lands, once imagined as a cohesive empire, became a mosaic of hundreds of independent territories, duchies, principalities, free cities, and ecclesiastical states, each navigating its own course. Religiously, the Peace of Westphalia confirmed the division of Europe into Catholic and Protestant spheres. The old idea of a unified Christendom was dead. In its place emerged a continent where rulers could no longer dictate religious conformity beyond their borders. Calvinism was now formally recognized alongside Lutheranism and Catholicism. The wars of religion had forced Europe to accept pluralism, not necessarily through enlightenment, but exhaustion. France emerged from the war as the dominant power in Western Europe. Its victory over the Habsburgs, both Spanish and Austrian, elevated its influence and expanded its territory. Under the reign of Louis XIV, France would soon pursue new wars and new ambitions, but always within the framework Westphalia had created. Spain, though still vast in territory, entered a period of slow decline. The war revealed its limits, both militarily and economically. The loss of the Dutch provinces and its defeats in Germany and France marked the beginning of its retreat from European preeminence. Sweden, meanwhile, became a major power in Northern Europe. It held territories in the Baltic and within the empire itself, and for a time, it was one of the continent's leading military and diplomatic actors. But it too would eventually be eclipsed, its power challenged by rising neighbors like Russia and Prussia. And then there were the people, millions of ordinary men, women, and children who had lived and died through the war. The trauma of the 30 Years' War seeped into culture, memory, and literature. It became a symbol of chaos, cruelty, and the price of unchecked ambition. It reminded generations that ideology, when fused with politics and power, could become a weapon of mass suffering. But even amid destruction, the war birthed something new. The Peace of Westphalia became a foundation for modern international law. It established the precedent that nations, regardless of size or religion, had a right to self-determination and sovereignty. It introduced the idea that peace could be brokered through balanced negotiation, not just dominance. It laid the groundwork for diplomacy between equals, rather than decrees from emperors or popes. Europe would go to war again, many times, but it would never forget the lesson of those 30 long years. That war without end devours not only enemies, but entire civilizations. And so, the 30 Years' War passed into history. A war that began with a violent act in Prague and ended with a whisper in Westphalia. A war that reshaped maps, thrones, and souls. A war that taught the world that even fire must burn itself out.